Thank you so much, Dean Sterling and Professor Pittard, for introducing me, and thank you all for being with me tonight. So I'm going to get started without any further ado, but don't worry, there's plenty of ado built into the speech itself. So I appreciate this invitation for several reasons, and for all of those, and out of respect for your time, I plan to bring you along with me along a path of thoughts I've had over the past few years, though I have a handful of caveats that I'd like to mention up front. I can introduce the first one just by introducing myself. I'm a writer, though I didn't necessarily set out to be one, graduated from Divinity School roughly 7 years ago now, and I expected that I would continue on in academia. In fact, I entered a doctoral program upon graduation, so the expectation was at the time pretty well founded. But somewhere in the course of things, life happened. I got pregnant with my first child, dropped out of school, took a staff writing job at a small Washington, D.C. magazine, and I began learning to write. Journalism and parenthood sort of have this in common. There's plenty of preparatory information available, but the only training that matters is the on-the-job kind. I worked for a while at the Washington Post, then at the New York Times, and now I work at the Atlantic. I have 2 children, a kindergartner and a toddler, and I'm still learning to write and parent. So here's the first caveat. I'm 30 years old. That's probably not very much older than some of you, perhaps the same age as a number of you, and younger than others. This does not escape me, which is to say, I don't mean to project a wisdom of experience here that I don't actually have. On the contrary, I mean this talk to sketch out the shape of some thoughts I've mulled as I've grown with my peers and have tried to understand the moral difficulties we all seem to have faced and the ways we've attempted to deal with them. I'll state the nature of these difficulties, which is the subject of this lecture, in just a moment. The second caveat is that having been out of school for so long, I've rarely had the chance to talk these things over with people. Spent quite a long time reading about them on my own. This is to prepare you for what will certainly be some hilarious mispronunciations. So I'm apologizing for that in advance. Listening to people say words on YouTube only gets you so far. They say things wrong too, sometimes hilariously so. So this is all just to say it's going to be funny. Just bear with me. And this all brings me to the problem that I mean to address, which I'll first describe in blunt and explicit terms, and then, because that form of explanation is always inadequate, I'll illuminate better with a discussion of a piece of art. Here is the problem as I understand it. We contemporary inheritors of the Enlightenment are increasingly intolerant of ambiguity, which is to say that we tend more and more to reject the idea that it is acceptable or even good for things to remain uncertain, unclear, or mysterious. It isn't that we refuse to believe that some things are uncertain, unclear, or mysterious. Some things simply do match those descriptors. But we don't consider that fact that some things are that way, ambiguous, I mean, not immediately amenable to total comprehension, to be a good thing. Usually that quality is weighted at nil. It's meaningless. It adds nothing. In some cases, it's quite clearly coded negatively, a problem to be dealt with or a hassle to be put up with, an obstacle to be overcome. And so we have, broadly speaking, come to prefer the instantly comprehensible, the clear and the obvious, the totally illuminated and entirely revealed over the ambiguous and the mysterious, the concealed and the shrouded, the uncertain. I believe this is true aesthetically, and I believe it is true morally. I further believe that the aesthetic tendency and the moral tendency are distinct, but linked. And I think that this tendency is a problem. Again, speaking broadly in hopes of refining these ideas as I go on, I've begun to think that this sensibility results in all sorts of ill effects. The first of them is that when one sets out to defeat mystery, to further the victory of enlightened comprehensibility, oftentimes the mystery remains just as implacable as it always was, and the defeat isn't one of revelation, although it might masquerade as such, but rather one of defacement and mutilation. In other words, in the conquest of seeing more, I think we often end up seeing less than we began with. That gives way to a second major problem. The defiling of genuine mystery doesn't eliminate the human interest in profundity, meaning, and so on. And those things exist under the penumbra of mystery. Mystery is sort of this shady canopy that protects meaning. Yet once the real and true mysteries have been so thoroughly defaced, imposters arise to take their place. We wind up living in a world of counterfeit meaning, a quality I associate with some of the politics that I worry most about. And so there is the statement of the problem, roughly speaking. I'll expand on all of that as we go. But before then, I want to show you an expression of this tendency to reject or underweight ambiguity in concrete form, and I hope that that will clarify what I have in mind. So, what we have here is an installation exhibit. It's a piece by the artist Damien Hirst, who first premiered it in 1996. It features 12 steel, concrete, and glass tanks, each filled with formaldehyde solution, and a vertical slice of a bull or a cow. It's not easy to see here from this angle, but the bull and cow, they alternate pieces. So, the end piece may be of the bull and then the cow and then the bull and so forth. This particular piece, entitled Some Comfort Gained from the Acceptance of the Inherent Lies in Everything, intersperses slices of the bull with slices of the cow at some distance from one another, allowing the viewer to peer at the separate anatomical features of either in the gaps in between them. Hirst featured a similar installation in 1993 entitled Mother and Child Divided, which includes a cow and calf, each sliced in half, nose to tail. I'm going to show you a second view here. And there we go. Of his work on cows, Hirst has said, in a way, you understand more about living people by dealing with dead people. It's sad, but you feel more. My cows cut up in formaldehyde have more personality than any cows walking around in fields. For Hirst, these exhibits remark upon the inherent violence in relationships and the illusions required to sustain intimacy. Cut us in half, he has said, and we're all the fucking same. Hirst is a bold and direct artist, and so these works and many others, which I recommend taking a look at because he's also a very thoughtful artist, express a collection of what I suspect are relatively common tendencies in a particularly brutal, to borrow his own descriptor, way. But don't let the brutality of the demonstration distract you from the ordinariness of the sentiment. What Hirst suggests is that the living creature in motion, with its will and its hide intact, conceals too much, that it appears to be an integrated whole with a unique presence, but that this appearance is really better understood as a lie, and that the lie is best dispelled by the disassembly of the creature, revealing the truth of it. For Hirst, the truth is that there is no uniqueness and no special meaning contained in the brutally split and splayed body. I think he may well be right about that, which I'll return to, and more importantly, that the split and splayed body is the real and final truth of the creature. It isn't surprising that Hirst's reading extends not just to the physical presence of animals, but to their, and by implication, our relationships. If the thing you think you see is really a lie, propped up by a puppet-like, by nothing but chalky sticks of bone and dwindling chunks of meat, then what of the bonds formed between those things? There's a distance between the slices of bull and cow, as if to say, here are these two creatures as they really are. What about these matter-of-factly grotesque segments of flesh could ever make you think the two of them could in some mystical sense become one? And in the same goes for mother and calf. Surely, if there were some enduring meaning to whatever bond we imagine existing between them, it would be visible here under our glass, in the bright white light of the gallery where all is revealed. But there's nothing there, just two animals which, at the point of bisection, are virtually indistinguishable from one another, and why would you bother to distinguish them anyhow? Perhaps now these odd ideas have become to sound a little more familiar. In the dedication of his 2006 book, The God Delusion, the English biologist Richard Dawkins, who has made much more of a name for himself as a critic of the numinous, quoted his friend Douglas Adams, author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I guess is also a movie. Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too? By way of clarification, Dawkins once remarked in an interview that we have science. Science is by no means complete. There's a lot that we don't know, but we're working on it. We're working on building up a complete picture of the universe, which if we succeed will be a complete understanding of the universe and everything that's in it. So I don't understand why religious people waste their time going into this other stuff, which has never added anything to the storehouse of human wisdom, and I don't see that it ever will. Now that should sound much more familiar, though I don't mean to single out Dawkins' particular brand of humanism for special sanction. It's part of a much larger tendency that I've tried to sketch out in brief here, one that demands the unmasking and denuding of all things, and registers very little patience with things that can't be easily unmasked or denuded, then often finds only cold comfort in whatever is left behind after the obliteration of ambiguity. And so while Dawkins unravels the secrets of the entire cosmos, let me say a few words about what brought us to this unusual place of bright light and slaughtered cows, what it's given us, and what it's cost us. Plutarch, the ancient Greek author, politician, and priest, wrote sometime in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of a statue that once stood in the Egyptian city of Sais, the cultic hub of the early goddess Neith, who was said to have created the cosmos and all of its contents. The statue was shaped in the likeness of the goddess Isis, Plutarch wrote, enthroned and draped with a veil, and it bore an interesting inscription: I am all that has been, and is, and shall be, and no mortal has ever lifted my garment. There was a bit of cultural telephone in play. The goddess was almost certainly Neith, not Isis, though Greeks at the time tended to syncretize the two, identifying both with Athena. The garment has been translated variably as a mantle or a veil or the deity's entire gown, but those confusions don't much alter Plutarch's reading of the statue, nor the impression that it made on his inheritors. And he had many inheritors. In 1807, the German scholar Alexander von Humboldt sent the German poet Goethe an edition of the former's recent book on South American plants, Ideas for a Geography of Plants, with a special engraving featured on the dedication page. The image showed a nude youth with a lyre in one hand, lifting the veil from the statue of a strange goddess with the other. Apollo, the god of, among other things, poetry, doing his part to lift the veil of Isis and reveal the secrets of nature, the secrets of the cosmos. Here, Neith, Isis, Athena, whoever you want, this primordial goddess of the cosmos stands in for nature. It was Humboldt's way of thanking Goethe for the metamorphosis of plants. This was Goethe's own lovely work on the secret lives of flora. Poets, too, Humboldt meant to say, had their part to play in the revelation of nature's truths. By that point, the Enlightenment was well underway and coming near to its climax. A great illumination of all things was in order. In the sciences, empiricism and experimentation had given rise to the foundations of what we now recognize as modern medicine, technology, and so on. In politics, rational forms of governance, typically certain forms of liberal democracy, in which the more impenetrable aspects of human life, like spirituality and religion, are pointedly excluded from public life in order to create a universally accessible kind of what we now call public reason, were ascendant in their early forms. Now, I will pause here as a sop to some well-intended critics who know who they are, who will say, but Liz, there are other forms of liberalism that don't automatically exclude these sort of matters of ultimate concern from public life. They're sort of inspired by Rousseau, and they have a sort of totalizing program for spirituality and so forth. That's true, and they did not succeed. One of the challenging things about championing ambiguity and subtlety in an era in which those principles are somewhat out of favor is that those principles are somewhat out of favor. So I'll be blunt and absolute, despite myself here. I don't mean to say that the contributions of the Enlightenment were worthless, or that the era not had to have happened, or that it would have been better, for instance, to never develop rigorous scientific methods through which reliable medicines could then be developed and tested. Not at all. That's not what I'm saying. Rather, what I would point out is that in this era, there was, in fact, still quite a bit of weight given to ambiguity, mystery, subtlety in themselves. This is why Goethe could at once admire and contribute to the scientific advances that would unveil nature, tell the secrets of plants, the metamorphosis of plants. By this he means photosynthesis, the sort of magic of plants regenerating and blooming. And still commit plenty of enigmatic and richly profound verse to the page. It seemed entirely possible then that the storehouse of human wisdom must be, stocked from each source. With one hand, you lift the veil, with the other, you play the lyre. In fact, they were not as unique in that sense as we or they may have presumed. When the medieval era came up in art and discourse at this point in time, that is Goethe's point in time, broadly speaking, it was either idealized in contrast to the vast, mechanical, anonymized world quickly unfolding post-Enlightenment as they moved into the modern era, or pilloried in the reverse. Those were the Dark Ages, these are the light. But the medievals themselves had a much more robust and sensitive relationship to ambiguity than either of those simplistic renderings. Contrary to their present reputation as benighted fools dogmatically bent on maintaining ignorance of the natural world as a means to securing domination of the laboring classes, medieval scholars were in fact interested in the sciences, and they were not, despite many such tellings, totally deprived of the observations of their Greek and Roman predecessors on that front, nor many others. There was a profound and sustained interest in rigor and reason, in other words, that animated medieval thought. It did not emerge ex nihilo sometime in the Renaissance, or simply resurface courtesy of somebody lucky rediscovering Lucretius, as certain authors would have it. In fact, so lively was the medieval tendency towards a certain scholastic rigor that there developed in the late medieval period a kind of dialectic in Christian theology concerning the sort of thing I'm discussing here now. That is, the proper quarter to be given to mystery, ineffability, and hiddenness in discussions of God. One of the great classics of the genre is the short book, The Cloud of Unknowing, which perhaps fittingly belongs to no known author. It was written in Middle English sometime in the latter half of the 14th century as a guide to contemplative prayer, and takes special care to guide novices in Christian mysticism toward the divine. Now, the contemplative may acquire all sorts of knowledge of scripture and literature, the author submits, and of the doctrines of sin and redemption, and the desire to know those things and the will to learn them are good. But all of those things are created things. The doctrines, the liturgy, the scripture, these are all the offspring, as it were, of human beings. They're creations of human beings further towards participation in the life of the church and reaching the sacraments and so on and so forth, right? It's easy enough to begin to mete out a framework to understand something you yourself created, or that a peer mind created, right? I can look at a toy car or something that one of my kids brings me and says, Mom, it's broken. And I can kind of begin to figure out maybe how to put it back together because I can think about how the person who put it together in the first place put it together. And then it's much easier to think about how the person who broke it, because that's a baby brain. And so those things are fairly easy to understand. And yet, says the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, however much spiritual understanding a person may have in knowing about all created spiritual things, still by the work of his understanding he can never gain knowledge of an uncreated spiritual being, which is God alone. Therefore, only by the failure of his understanding can he do so, because the one thing in which his understanding fails is God alone. It was for this reason that Saint Denis said, "The godliest knowledge of God is that which is known through ignorance." Where the end of your understanding comes, where you find that your faculty of reason has completely run out of frameworks. It's just not going anywhere. That's where you are in the outer mists of the cloud of unknowing, which is the presence of the divine. To which one might say, okay, all well and good, but in that case, why bother with contemplation at all? If you can't understand something, and in fact only know you've hit upon the thing itself by the fact that your comprehension fails, what's the point of contemplating it? This is precisely what the author means to address. There are aspects of the divine that are perfectly comprehensible. Consider, for instance, the very literal narratives contained in parables, which even children can understand and enjoy, right? You tell them about Noah's Ark, oh yeah, I get it. There are a bunch of animals on a boat, that's cool. And yet, those are the very same aspects that contain depths which, when contemplated, bring the mind to those outer mists of incomprehensibility. There's this wonderful passage in Augustine. It's amazing, the quote compilations, the anthologies of Augustine are always lower tier Augustine's, B-team Augustine. The best parts of Augustine are tossed off in the middle of City of God or something, or like in the back of De Trinitate or something, just where he's just sort of like on an odyssey, just riffing. And he tosses off like, well, Scripture is inspired by God, and it's so capacious that any given story has stacked up meanings, and you can read it down until you get to the point where you've come to a kind of point of mystical contact. So you start out at a level of comprehensibility, but you keep going. And this I've found to be a very helpful way of thinking about Scripture, to the point where it becomes impossible to have a conversation with someone who says, I read this literally. I'm like, I don't know. There's 1,000 things here. Which one are you talking about? Here we confront the shroud of holiness that marks the distinction between God and man. At this meeting, we seek not to comprehend, but simply to join the divine presence, to know that we are with God. We behold and we are beheld. There's an extraordinary peace that emanates precisely from the fact that there is no more rationalizing, dissecting, or explaining to be done by us. It is beyond us. It is ecstasy, the author says. One might then pose the following question. If it isn't simply factual, but also good that there remain elements of the divine that are unknowable to us, that this provides the context for all kinds of freedom and contemplation and experience that elevate the spirit, then can the desire to know God or anything else not at some base level be called evil? If what you're trying to get to at the end of this process is some kind of unknowing, then why not start there? Why ever try to know anything? Isn't it the case that all of our learning is in fact us pulling ourselves away from this direct ecstatic vision? Such questions arose even in the ancient world, not a ridiculous question. This is in fact a fairly common Gnostic, to use a loose term very loosely. reading of the Garden of Eden narrative, right? In which a false god intends to maintain the allegiance of humankind through an enforced ignorance, that is, by forbidding them from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In this reading, it is only through disobedience to this false god that Adam and Eve, and thus humankind, matures into its enlivened and awakened state. But those aren't the only two options. Either the desire to know is evil and God condemns it, or the desire to know is good and only a false God condemns it, and everything that appears to be transgression is actually an expression of holy human agency. This is where you get into, like, Hermann Hesse. The third way, in my view, the correct answer, is that the desire to know is inherent, it's good, and it is most enlivening not in its satisfaction, but in its searching. And the fact that certain understanding remains impossible is therefore good for us. It quickens us. It draws us higher and higher. A good illustration of the point arrives in Gregory of Nyssa's notion of eternal progression. Gregory, a 4th century bishop in Cappadocia, which is modern-day Turkey, is one of those perennially lovely companions for a number of reasons, but perhaps especially because he has a very apt answer to the question that one sometimes hears about the nature of heaven. If you get to heaven and it's all great and wonderful, and you finally understand the mysteries of life and all that, and then you've just got to sit there for the rest of eternity like you're in church, won't you be really bored? This is not a ridiculous question. Humans are not built for stagnation. We're creative and mutable creatures. People who ask that, they're not being ridiculous. Vacation Bible school question, but it's not a silly one. This is why mystery is so critical. Gregory sees this. He says, made to desire and not abandon the transcendent height by things already attained, he says this in his commentary on the life of Moses, the soul makes its way upward without ceasing, ever through its prior accomplishments, renewing its intensity for the flight. Such an experience seems to me to belong to the soul which loves what is beautiful, he goes on, which echoes Diotima's remarks to Socrates in Plato's Symposium very clearly to my ear. Hope always draws the soul from the beauty which is seen to what is beyond, always kindles the desire for the hidden through what is constantly perceived. Therefore, the ardent lover of beauty, although receiving what is always visible as an image of what he desires, yet longs to be filled with the very stamp of the archetype. This truly is the vision of God, never to be satisfied in the desire to see him, but one always, by looking at what he can see, rekindles his desire to see more. Thus, Gregory concludes, there's simply no limit to the soul's ascent. One can always come closer to God, grow in virtue, continue to change, and discover God is simply that infinite. The great mystery draws us on and on and on, and so in eternity, we continue to seek and learn, and that's why even in heaven we remain human, and we keep changing, and we keep growing, because we're still learning. So I'm now due for what in journalism we call a to be sure section, which is a break in the music of an essay to pay some homage to reasonable reservations the more spirited argumentation may have provoked. I have 3 reservations in particular that I want to accept as premises of my own. First of all, I don't mean to pit the wise ancients against, or the pious medievals for that matter, against the straying early moderns or we fallen postmoderns. This phenomenon, this oscillation between an idealization of moral and factual absolutes and a deference to certain forms of ambiguity, it's interspersed throughout every historical period, right? We happen to be in one posture of the oscillation, but we could easily be in another. There are people with whom our lives have very nearly overlapped, who have lived in worlds much like those of Gregory and certainly Goethe, more so than Dawkins or Hurst, right? The post-war French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, for example, writes in his final essay, Eye and Mind, against a theory of painting that treats artworks as mere empirical representations of reality, disembodied from the artist's hands, objective and instantly terminal. In what could be read as a sort of argument against Hirst, Merleau-Ponty says that if no painting ever completes painting, if no work itself is ever absolutely completed, still each creation changes, alters, clarifies, deepens, confirms, exalts, recreates, or creates by anticipation all the others. If creations are not permanent acquisitions, it is not just that, like all things, they pass away. It is that they have almost their entire lives ahead of them. They contain mysteries. They draw you on, and they draw you on, and they draw you on. Nothing that really means anything can ever actually just be said. That's why all these years later, we're still talking about Hamlet, right? I read my daughter's books every night. One that I've read them 1,000 times is Corduroy's Seasons, the little teddy bear, these 4 seasons. I think we're covered on it. Don't need to submit any articles about it, not planning on writing it up anytime soon. I don't typically lie down in bed and kind of like nudge my husband and say, you ever think about Corduroy's fall page? Right? I've got it. But Hamlet, I still think about quite frequently, right? I mean, all the time. There are entire monologues from Hamlet that I've memorized. And this is true of any great work of art. It's true of paintings, right? There are details that you go back to and you run over and over and over again in your mind. It's because there's a mystery in them. There's something unsaid that you want to say. And the beauty of it is that when you say that thing, someone else will read your commentary and say, yes, but there's something further. To take another example from the arts, Junichiro Tanizaki, a Japanese author who achieved his greatest acclaim after the Second World War and lived in the mid-1960s, as did Ponty, wrote a remarkable book in praise of shadows, from which this talk takes its title. Tanizaki's book is mainly concerned with contrasting traditional Japanese aesthetics, by then in some decline due to the encroachment of Western technologies and the reconstruction effort after World War II, against their contemporary successors. One might expect to find arguments from comfort and familiarity, but Tanizaki's assessment is more exacting and more damning for the West. In one particularly beautiful section, and I very highly recommend this book because it's exquisite, it's short, it's just gorgeous. Tanizaki notes, for instance, that lacquerware is not something that's meant to be seen in brilliant light, to be taken in at a single glance. It should be left in the dark, a part here and a part there picked up by a faint light. Its florid patterns recede into the darkness, conjuring in their stead an inexpressible aura of depth and mystery, of overtones but partly suggested. The sheen of the lacquer set in the night reflects the wavering candlelight, announcing the drafts that find their way from time to time in the quiet room. Under the command of a totalizing electric light, lacquerware is a nice plate. In the context imagined by its artisan, it is but one component of what Tanizaki describes aptly as a dream world, the sort of place where meals shared in intimacy between friends take on all kinds of tones and sheens, and they impress themselves upon memory so deeply as to become part of the mythology of yourself. The second reservation that I mean to accept is that I don't mean to suggest that the only applications of this concern of mine have to do with dinnerware or contemplative prayer or art installations. I'm a really big fan of all of those things, but I think this tendency I've tried to outline appears in much more commonplace and immediate instances as well. Some aspect of sex, for instance, has to do with knowledge. It's not an accident that an archaic way of mentioning it refers to it as knowing someone in a particular sense, the biblical way, you might say, or attaining carnal knowledge. Insofar as the sensations of sex are pretty predictable over time, what remains fascinating in terms of conquest are the details of a particular person, right? So for the Lothario, a greater and more acute awareness of a new individual, and for a committed long-term pair, it's a greater and sharpened and detailed understanding of the other person. Keeping in mind that people are always changing, there's also always more learning for a committed partnership to do, right? But modernity has provided a sort of shortcut around the effort and vulnerability a genuine Casanova would have to front in order to achieve that kind of discovery, and that's pornography. Here I fulfill my early promise to return to Hirst's notion of the brutality of the splayed and displayed body. It's funny, you read these older books, I'm thinking here a lot of sort of Restoration era, 18th century literature about these sort of raucous sort of Casanova types who were going out and getting laid constantly. And these guys are like crying all the time. They're getting turned down a lot, and they're getting rejected, and it is massively destructive for the ego. They're having a good time. They're also having a very bad time. And there's just so more exposure of the ego here than like sitting behind a computer screen totally anonymized, right? So even that form of this, same sort of knowledge-seeking and, sort of collecting and cataloging behavior was at one point, at least, there was a little bit more at stake for the individual. The pornographic gaze, in the most literal form, I think, is probably the greatest and most literal example of the totalizing, sort of rationalizing, revealing tendency that I'm talking about here. In porn, unlike in sex, bodies are witnessed from a sort of disembodied third-person phantom presence. This is part of actually what Merleau-Ponty is talking about in Observations of Painting. They have to be observed in an embodied way and also painted in an embodied way. And pornography is intentionally sort of disembodied as it can be. The lights are clinically bright, cameras are permitted, almost a gynecological access to performers. As in Hirst's artwork, there's got to be space between the slices of the creatures the viewer wants to see in order for every lie to be dispelled by the searching eye. And like Hirst's cows, denuded of their mystique and meaning, what the viewer finds when all is surgically separated and presented under white light frame by frame is a version of sex reducible to meat and bones and the pittance you pay for it, right? When I say that the mutilated and defaced form of the thing deprived of mystery becomes its de facto reality, consider that many children, some studies put the average age of first childhood exposure to pornography for American kids at 11 years, know sex firstly and primarily through porn. But it's so far from the thing that it distantly resembles, right? When you experience sex in an embodied way, think about where your eyes are compared to where your genitals are. It's a very different viewing experience from something like pornography. It's an embodied viewing experience. There's mystery there, but not when it's done like a Hirst artwork. To put it another way, why ought we make certain that new parents have the means and time to be with their newborn children? Critics of this policy on the right have argued that parental leave is more or less strictly about breastfeeding, that there are certain acknowledged health benefits that come with nursing an infant, one that may provide competitive advantages to the child later in life, and that the period of leave is permitted to a mother to advance her child's position thusly, that you are advantaging the baby, maybe 1 IQ point or something like that, by nursing, and that's why we allow maternity leave at all. Meanwhile, defenders of the policy to the left will argue that parental leave is, in fact, a valid form of work, right? That's the defense. In this scenario, paid parental leave is justified because the parent is performing something close enough to market labor to be worth a wage. That's why it should be paid, because I'm working. I'm basically just doing the job that would be done otherwise by a professional childcare worker. Most articles arguing in this vein provide a detailed blow-by-blow of a new mother's days with a heavy emphasis on the drudgery and the repetitive thanklessness of it all. And after all, what else is work? But have you ever heard anything so ugly in all your life? Not that people ought not breastfeed or that there isn't quite a lot of drudgery involved in kneeling with a newborn, but that we as a society so heavily overweight these explicit, rationalized exposures of new parenthood, or motherhood, I'll now say, to speak from experience, such that we have to argue for one of the most meaningful and profound things there is in the most degrading terms possible. In Hurst's Cows all over again, right? Mother, child, divided. Aren't these creatures just meat? Mostly interchangeable. Can't someone else get the food into the infant? Why should I be responsible for some heifer's calf? But it isn't just nursing, nor is nursing mostly or even mainly about some competitive advantage. And it's not all akin to market labor, though it is work. To have a child is to become a co-creator of humankind, to arise one day and find that you yourself have brought to the world an entirely new person, new thoughts, a new vision. This new life breathes new life into yours, and you are made new again too. Everything is transformed. Beauty, the philosopher Elaine Scarry writes, as both everyday life and Plato's Symposium confirm, prompts the begetting of children. When the eye sees someone beautiful, the whole body wants to reproduce this person. This phenomenon of unceasing begetting sponsors in people like Plato, Aquinas, and Dante the idea of eternity. Why paid leave? Because I'm doing something more important than market labor. What is it that I'm doing in particular? Well, I'm nursing, sure, and changing diapers and trimming nails and going to the pediatrician and all that, but mainly I can't say what I'm doing because I don't precisely know. I can't see it from where I am because I've managed to touch eternity from my vantage point in history. In a good society, the soul can argue from beauty. And then there is this last reservation. If there are mysteries that endure, and it is good that they endure, and if we are never satisfied in our discoveries, aren't we doomed to a kind of eternal dissatisfaction? What about that cold comfort Hurst mentions? Isn't that really the best we can hope for? Maybe there aren't fairies in your garden, and in that case, it's just bugs and weeds, but we can live with the bugs and the weeds, right? At least we know what we're dealing with. There's some dignity in that. But I don't think so, and I don't think so for a couple of reasons. First, as I've said, I believe human beings are hardwired to search, and in particular to search for meaning, which, as I've also said, I think is sheltered under a canopy, a penumbra of mystery. In that case, we may well extinguish the mystery and meaning of any number of things and tell ourselves it's for the best, that we've lifted the veil of superstition from the logical mechanics of science, economics, and politics, etc. But that cold comfort does not suffice for everyone, and some number of people wind up looking for mystery, as I mentioned earlier, and finding counterfeit versions fashioned with ill intent. In Male Fantasies, his 2-volume study of the novels, letters, and personal papers of German Freikorpsmen, the forerunners of the Nazi SS, German sociologist Klaus Teweleit does a very edifying job of locating the seeds of what would later grow into the elaborate mythology of the Third Reich. And all of it is wrapped up in romance, right? Dreams of the occult, apocalypses, heroic golden ages of yore, Arthurian revivals, mystical brotherhoods, and so on, the creations of a mythological nation. The fascist whispers of today are no different. They promise to re-enchant a world drained of meaning with a revitalization of ancient blood and a reconsecration of sacred soil. This is all counterfeit, of course. It's a sham. These mysteries are hollow and meaningless. They are manufactured. They do not beget as beauty does. Instead, they destroy. But to a person otherwise deprived of meaning, these cheap and evil fantasies may seem alluring. I worry a good deal about that. But what of the other matter? Does giving some credence to mystery mean accepting some permanent dissatisfaction? Adopting, as it were, a tragic outlook? I would argue that the alternative seems just as tragic, but I would also say that opening one's eyes to the brilliant shadows in the universe is not an unhappy experience. It isn't a permanent loss. The German poet Rilke, a favorite of mine, put it well in Archaic Torso of Apollo, also a favorite of mine, which I'll read to you now because it's short and because poetry says less and thus means more than prose in any case. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not from all the borders of itself burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a stimulating lecture. We have time for questions. I would ask you, I'll just call on you, if you would stand so we can hear you, identify yourself, and make your question as succinct as you can. My line is, please disguise your comment as a question. So the floor is open.
Poem's talking about a statue, by the way, like a broken one, not a guy.
Well, I will ask you a question, and I'll break the ice. So I couldn't help but think, as you were describing about knowledge, that is what I would call discursive knowledge. And there is another form of knowledge that people who generally think in mystical terms think about intuitive knowledge, which cannot be described by discursive statements. So whether you're talking about Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, or Christian mystics, or Jewish mystics, it's the same thing. So do you recognize a type of intuitive knowledge as part of this quest that you were describing, and what role does that play?
Yeah, I mean, I think, people have to develop their interior worlds, and there's a lot of stimulation, right? And that's always a challenge. How do you achieve the kind of contemplation, for instance, that Gregory of Nyssa would talk about, or that Cloud of Unknowing is referring to? Contemplation was hard even for the contemplatives, right? And this is why the Cloud of Unknowing exists, because it's difficult. And they talk about it, being this extraordinary challenge, this kind of via dolorosa. And now, all the more so because there are so many avenues of stimulation. I strongly endorse trying to cut out some space for contemplation. It's even if it's reading, even if it's prayer, even if it's meditation, just developing that kind of internal compass, which I think is where intuition can flourish. And then, also you have knowledge that arises discursively from engagements, and I think that's also extremely important.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? John?
You're supposed to stand?
Yeah, just so everyone can hear you. Brock, do you have a mic?
Up there.
Oh, okay, never mind. Just speak up if you would, John.
First of all, thank you. I mostly just want to say amen. I really appreciated this. I'm wondering how this, the unknowingness of this mystery at the heart of things, the unknowableness, is compatible with like a deep trust in its goodness rather than its indifference or maybe even evil. And is there a way of understanding how this kind of that peace and trust goes along with this amplification of mystery?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, I thought one option for ending this was the archaic torso of Apollo. The other was with a "you feel me?" So much of it comes down to the interlocutor, right? I got onto this path at Cambridge, and I trusted and I loved my tutors, right? My tutor, John Hughes, was a Christian socialist. He unfortunately passed away very young. His tutor was John Milbank. He's a fascinating guy. But that whole crew is familial in their density. I'm still close with a lot of those scholars. And they're all people of faith as well, High Church Anglicans and Roman Catholics and so forth. And so obviously it's not difficult, I'm very open about my commitments, right? When I say, my strong sense of mystery and dedication to it, I clearly believe in God and the goodness thereof. How are you going to give yourself over to a sense of mystery when you don't have that sort of anchor, right? And you're confused or uncertain about what the moral ramifications of that might be? I think that's a very good question. And I can think of routes to answer it, the transcendental route, right? I mean, there's a transcendentalist or Rousseau type reading of nature as having, qualities that tend towards harmony or growth or regeneration that I think register as, if not good, then balanced. I can think of Eastern religious, to use a term that doesn't quite fit well, but ways of reading nature as being home to an inherent balance, which maybe, doesn't map perfectly onto what we say when we mean good in the sort of Western philosophical tradition. But that can be a place in which you put your trust in the mystery, if you want to lean into it all the way, I would think.
We can take one more question if you'd like to pose it. Oh, you've got two. Can each ask a question, ask them, and then we'll let her respond. Okay?
Hi, my name's Daniel. I'm a PhD student in the history department. Thanks for this. This is wonderful. I was wondering if you could speak to what is maybe a flip side of what you call sham mystery in our contemporary politics, the promise of a re-enchantment that often comes from sources on the right, which might be something like a sham unmasking, a promise that often comes with a promise of enchantment that in fact we're going to peel back the qualities of the world as we understand it now in order to reveal the real machinations and workings of it. Is sham unmasking a cousin of sham mystery, or is it a cousin of a more sincere unmasking?
And we'll let the other person ask his question as well.
Thanks, Liz. I'm Evan Rosa, work at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture.
Yeah, I know who you are.
I know who you are. And I'm just curious about, in a similar vein, perhaps different, what the political and social implications of this view might be for you, particularly around the sharing of information, shared knowledge, shared truth.
Right. So I think there are, and I tried to thread this right clearly. There are genuine and good forms of discovery, right? These are in the sciences and so forth, where explicit information, explicit discovery is a good thing. The importance is just that the habit of mind that comes along with it doesn't gobble up everything else, right? Jean Bishkelstein, her name is actually Jean, but I thought she was a guy the first time I saw her name, and so I assumed she was a French guy. So this has become a verbal tic. This is why you should not read by yourself. So she has this great note in an essay that was in a New Criterion collection actually in the 90s, Religion and the Bright Line, where she says, one of the problems of liberalism is that these very fearsome strains of liberal thought tend to gobble up competing ways of thinking, right? So contrary to the idea that in a sort of liberal democracy we'll have several different, comprehensive doctrines at play at once. The liberal one, tends to actually kind of consume them, right? And so what ends up happening is the sort of scientific way, if you will, or however you want to put it, the empirical way of thinking gobbles up all kinds of ways of thinking about things, what Merleau-Ponty is talking about, even art, right? Religion, et cetera, et cetera. And so you wind up with a very inopportune way of thinking about things because you've taken a sort of epistemic frame that is sort of misplaced and put it somewhere else. And that's a perennial challenge. But I do think that there are places where that is, those kinds of techniques and discoveries are valid and genuine and good. They're just not presumptive. They're not presumptive in Goethe, right? Even the word metamorphosis of plants is a very cool way to put it, right? As opposed to, there's a way, for instance, of writing about a plant photosynthesizing where you end up describing everything but the metamorphosis of a plant. You get like a chain of custody of a molecule as it photosynthesizes and becomes something different than it was, but you never capture the whole, right? That's a problem. But I think it's avoidable. When you talk about sham unmaskings, that's what I'm talking about when I say a misapplication of an epistemic frame that just mutilates the thing, right? And this is when you start to see sort of a disillusionment with whatever it is that you're going to break down. So typically when you have, for instance, a fascist regime, not that I've read what I've read, and I don't mean to presume, but you do see a phenomenon, at least historically, that's like this old way is effete, it is corrupt, I am going to pull the curtain back on it. These bonds that you thought you had with your neighbors, they're fake. They were forced upon you. These people are not your neighbors. They are parasites. They are XYZ. They are a problem. That's the mutilation of a genuine reality. How is it that these people are different than me and yet they are my neighbors? We are one. I don't know, genius. That's part of the mystery of life, right? I mean, yet you are. Look at them, they're right there, right? But then you have this counterfeit mystery that takes its place. You mutilate the genuine mystery, and you say, actually, some other person you've never heard of who has these qualities that I've pulled out of a hat and you have no relationship with, this is actually your mystical brother, because you share a lineage of Freya or whatever. And it's like, yeah, okay, I can see how you're trying to fill in this trench you just dug by scooping out this authentic thing. And you end up, creating a death cult, basically. It's a bad scene. And the social and cultural implications, I think, follow from that very well in terms of information sharing. I mean, I think, a lot of this is just relational. A lot of accepting some level of ambiguity, I think, is very conducive to building relationships, right? Because people are each individual is a little cosmos of mystery and change, right? And similar to God being so infinite that you can always keep learning. The people are not so very terribly different. They're the Imago Dei. They're variable, they change, they're mutable, they're always learning, and so they're always changing, and so you're always learning about them, and you're always changing in the process. And I think that comes with an acceptance of the fact that there are just ambiguities in people. The other way of looking at them is very static. I hear people say on TV, I was watching House, and I still watch House. I live in 2008. People don't change. You hear people say that. I'm like, what? Like, I live on a different planet. I don't know what you're talking about. People change every day, right? And people come downstairs. I'm only going to drink Soylent for a month, my husband said one day, and he did it. I mean, people change all the time. They have new experiences. They change in ways you can't predict. And then you have to change along with them. I'm now someone who knows a little bit about what happens when you only drink Soylent for a month. I wasn't before. Right, but that's part of the great adventure of life. And if you go into a relationship with the expectation that the person is just a static figure who's like a little wooden doll in your little hereditary miniature station, right, then you're going to have a bad time.
So we thank you for the careful ways in which you think about life and reality and how we perceive it, and we hope that you will continue to write as you have. Would you please join me in thanking